Have you ever noticed how sometimes when people talk about African history, it's like it only started when Europeans showed up?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like the continent was just sort of waiting around.
Exactly. And it's so frustrating because it's like this huge oversimplification, almost as if there wasn't anything interesting or important happening before then. But what if we dug a little deeper?
Right. What if we peeled back those layers? I bet we'd find some pretty incredible stuff.
I think so too. And luckily for us, we have the perfect starting point for this deep dive. J.C. DeGraff Johnson's African Glory.
Ah, yes. African Glory, the story of vanished Negro civilizations. It's a really compelling work.
It is. And I know you love getting to the core of a topic quickly. I think you're really going to enjoy this one.
Definitely. I've already had a chance to skim through it, and DeGraff Johnson does not mess around. He goes straight to the heart of the matter, challenging those Eurocentric views head on.
Yeah, he doesn't waste any time. And one of the first things that really stood out to me was that quote by Thomas Hodgkin, remember?
Oh, yeah, the one where he talks about how it's flattering to our vanity to imagine pre-colonial Africa as this primitive or barbarous place.
Exactly. He says that that whole notion just lacks historical foundation.
Mm.
And it's so powerful because he immediately backs it up with hard evidence.
Totally. Like he points out that while Europe was going through what they call the Dark Ages, the Empire of Ghana was thriving in West Africa.
Yep.
Like, just think about that for a second. Europe's struggling, and meanwhile, you have this well organized, powerful empire flourishing.
It's amazing. And it completely flips the script.
Yeah.
It challenges that narrative we've been fed. And it wasn't just Ghana either. D. Graff Johnson highlights so many other examples.
Oh, absolutely. We've got Timbuktu with its famous university in the 15th century.
A full-fledged university.
Yeah, not just some small local school either. This was a major center of learning, drawing scholars from all over. It really shows that Africa had a rich intellectual tradition long before any European influence.
It's so clear. And the author talks about the Ashanti and Yoruba civilizations too, right?
Yeah, he emphasizes how they were already highly organized and complex long before the British came in. It really throws a wrench in that whole idea that Africa owes its development to Europe.
It does. It makes you realize just how much of the story we've been missing, and you can feel how important this is to D. Graff Johnson. He even says that African scholars need to write the real history of Africa for an African reading public.
Yeah, I think he felt a real sense of urgency, to correct the record and reclaim the narrative. And then he takes us all the way back to ancient Egypt.
Oh, yes. This part was so fascinating. The book mentions this renowned Egyptologist, Sir Ernest A. Wallace Budge, who believed that the prehistoric natives of Egypt was African, and that the earliest settlers actually came from the south.
Right. That really challenges that image we often have of ancient Egypt as being somehow separate from the rest of the continent. But it also gets complicated because the book also includes this ancient Egyptian inscription where they're talking about black people in a really negative way.
Oh, wow. So even back then, you had these different perspectives and biases within Africa itself.
It shows the complexity, that it wasn't all just one big happy family. And then get this. During the 13th dynasty, a full-blooded Negro named Nasira actually became king of Egypt.
Whoa. So we actually have concrete evidence of someone of African descent ruling one of the most influential civilizations in the ancient world.
And it's not even just a one-off thing. You've also got the Nubian invasion of Egypt later on.
Right. They established the 25th dynasty, which lasted for over 50 years.
Exactly. So you have these clear examples of interaction and influence between Egypt and Nubia. And then the deep dive takes us to another major power, Carthage.
Ah, Carthage, the classic rival of Rome. But you're right, the book gives us so much more than just the basics.
Oh, for sure. Like just imagine Carthage around 300 BC, this massive city with these huge walls and temples and a bustling harbor.
It must have been incredibly impressive.
It was a real center of power in the Mediterranean. And although they were originally Phoenicians from the Levant,
So not native North Africans.
right, but their presence there led to some amazing interactions with the rest of the continent. Like, remember that voyage the Egyptian pharaoh Niku II commissioned?
One around Africa? That's wild.
Yeah, around 600 BC. According to Herodotus, it took them 3 years to complete the journey.
3 years. Just imagine setting sail and navigating the entire coastline of Africa. They must have had incredible seafaring skills.
Totally. And that wasn't the only one either. There was also Hanno's voyage a bit later.
Oh, yeah. He set sail with a fleet of 60 ships to explore the West African coast.
It's clear that there were these established connections between the Mediterranean and West Africa long before the Romans came along, and all this trade and interaction must have been happening too.
It really makes you wonder what sorts of things they were exchanging and what those interactions were like. And speaking of the Romans,
Ah, yes. Africa Romana.
what's interesting is that it wasn't just a brute force takeover by Rome. The book explains how they actually teamed up with some Numidian and Mauritanian leaders.
Yeah, those leaders wanted to break free from Carthage, and they saw an opportunity with Rome. Of course, it eventually led to those regions getting annexed by Rome, too.
Right. But by 42 BC, Rome controlled a massive chunk of North Africa, from Egypt all the way to Morocco.
And they didn't stop there either. The book even mentions Roman generals like Suetonius Paulinus reaching the headwaters of rivers that fed into the Niger River. And then there's Septimus Flaccus, who supposedly marched across the Sahara to reach the black man's country.
Wow. So they were venturing deep into the interior.
They were. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the book talks about how there were already pre-existing contacts between the Sudan and West Africa and the Mediterranean world.
Like there was trade and exchange happening long before the Romans showed up.
Exactly. And this just further dismantles that whole idea of Africa being isolated. It was connected to the wider world in all sorts of ways. And then there's that great story about Julius Caesar.
Oh, yeah. The one about his dream near the ruins of Carthage.
He dreamt of this massive army weeping, and it convinced him to rebuild the city.
That's so powerful. It's like a reminder of how history repeats itself and how important Carthage was.
For sure. Now, things were different back then because apparently North Africa was teeming with animals, like elephants, lions, ostriches.
Wait, really?
Yep, the book mentions it. It's likely that the climate was different, but also the Romans were notorious for hunting and using animals in their games, so they probably played a role in their disappearance too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And of course, North Africa was also crucial to Rome because it was their main source of grain.
The granary of Rome.
Exactly. It just shows how intertwined all these regions were. And I think it's important to remember that Rome wasn't just this monolithic entity.
Right. It wasn't just about ethnicity. It was this shared civilization, a common law that people from all over could be a part of. And you see this with the emperors, too, like Septimus Severus.
He was from Africa.
He was, and even though his first language was Punic and he had strong ties to his African heritage, he rose to become Emperor of Rome.
It's such a great example of how diverse the Roman world really was.
It truly was. And speaking of diversity, that brings us to the North African Church.
The rise of Christianity in Africa. It's a fascinating story.
It is. And it starts early. Even in the book of Acts, you have the story of the Ethiopian eunuch being baptized by Philip.
Right. And then by the 2nd century AD, we have those incredible accounts of the African martyrs in Carthage.
Like Perpetua and Felicitas. They were
Yeah.
Roman citizens, but they were executed for their faith. Their stories are so powerful.
They are. And then we can come back to Septimus Severus, who, although he became emperor, he actually issued an edict prohibiting new conversions to Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah, he was probably worried about how quickly Christianity was growing and how it might affect the stability of the empire.
It's interesting to see how the Roman state grappled with this new religion.
Definitely. And of course, all this was happening while you had other powerful kingdoms in Africa, like the Sudanese kingdom of Barrow.
Oh, yes. Ruled by those incredible queen mothers, the Candaces.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And then you have Alexandria, which became this huge intellectual hub for early Christianity.
With figures like Pantaenus Clement and Origen shaping Christian thought. It's amazing to think about the influence that North Africa had on the development of Christianity.
Absolutely. And then you have the big three, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine.
African giants of the early church.
Exactly. The book does a great job of highlighting their contributions and how important they were to shaping Christian doctrine.
And their influence wasn't limited to theology either. Augustine's writings on the fall of Rome and the nature of the state are still studied today.
They are. And all this time, Christianity was spreading further south into Nubia and Abyssinia, too.
The book even mentions the conversion of the Nobata people, thanks to the efforts of Empress Theodora. But it's also around this time that you start to see some pretty disturbing views emerging in Europe about black people and their supposed inferiority.
Yeah, it's like the seeds of racism were already being sown, and those ideas would eventually have horrific consequences. But before we get to that, there's a whole other chapter of African history, the Vandals.
Oh, yeah. They conquered Carthage in the 5th century AD,
Yeah.
and then they even sacked Rome. It was a chaotic time.
It was. And after the Vandals, you have a brief period of Byzantine rule before things really get shaken up with the rise of Islam.
Ah, Islam. This is where things get really interesting. The book sets the stage by talking about how there was all this religious intolerance going on in both the Byzantine and Persian empires.
Yeah, it was a time of conflict and division.
Yeah.
And that's when the Prophet Muhammad enters the scene in Arabia.
He initially faced a lot of pushback in Mecca.
Oh, for sure. His message was a threat to the established order, but he eventually returned to Mecca and consolidated his power. And his call for the rulers of Byzantium, Persia, and even China to embrace Islam was really audacious.
It was. And then after his death, the Muslim conquests just explode.
Yeah.
They conquer huge swaths of territory, including Syria, Persia, and Egypt.
And it happened incredibly quickly. But the book makes it clear that the conquest of North Africa beyond Egypt was a different story.
There was a lot of resistance.
Oh, tons. You had figures like Kusela and Kahina leading the charge. They were determined to protect their land and their way of life.
Yeah, it's important to remember that it wasn't just an easy takeover. But eventually the Arabs did gain control, and many Berber chiefs converted to Islam, including Tariq, who then played a key role in the conquest of Spain.
Right, that was a huge turning point.
It was. And while the Arab conquest wasn't always peaceful, it did lead to a lot of intermarriage between Arabs and Africans and the spread of Islam throughout the region.
Yeah, and unfortunately it also led to the decline of the North African Christian church. But then we get to one of my favorite parts, the rise of the great African empires in the Western Sudan.
Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, these were not small-time players.
No way. These were vast and powerful empires with intricate systems of governance and trade networks that stretched across the Sahara. Like, just think about that legendary gold nugget of Ghana.
The one that supposedly weighed a ton?
Yeah, it just shows you the incredible wealth of these empires.
And their capital cities were amazing too. The book describes Kumbi Saleh, the capital of Ghana, as having both a Muslim and a pagan section.
Right, it reflects that mixing of cultures and religions.
And then you have the Mali Empire with the famous Mansa Musa and his pilgrimage to Mecca.
Oh, yeah. His journey was epic. He brought so much gold with him that it actually messed up the value of gold in the Middle East.
Crazy. And his reign also saw the rise of Timbuktu as a center of scholarship and learning.
With the University of Sankore attracting scholars from all over. And then we have Ibn Battuta, who actually visited Mali and wrote about his experiences.
What did he have to say?
He was impressed by their justice system and how safe it was to travel there. And then the Songhai Empire emerged with Askia Muhammad's son, who implemented all these reforms and expanded their territory.
It's incredible to think about how much these empires achieved.
It is, but sadly, they all eventually declined. And around this time, you have the Portuguese starting to explore the West African coast.
Driven by their desire for gold ivory and a new route to the east.
Right. They were looking for ways to bypass the Ottoman Turks, who had control of the traditional land routes.
And Prince Henry the Navigator was a big driving force behind these expeditions.
He was fascinated by the legend of Prester John, too. But their arrival also marked the beginning of something truly terrible, the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah. And it's heartbreaking because their early encounters in the Congo revealed sophisticated kingdoms with skilled artisans and established social hierarchies.
They were clearly impressed by what they found, but sadly, the lure of profit and the dehumanizing ideology of racism took over.
And it's so important to remember that the slave trade was brutal and devastating.
It was. Millions of Africans were ripped from their homes and families and subjected to horrific conditions, and the impact of that loss is still felt today.
Absolutely. But even in the face of such unimaginable suffering, there were still acts of resistance.
Oh, yes. The book mentions the Coromantee Negro slaves who were known for their strength and their willingness to fight back. And then there were the numerous rebellions that happened on the Gold Coast and in the Americas.
The Fanti Confederation was another example of organized resistance against European influence.
Right. And you have figures like Casely Hayford who championed West African unity and challenged colonial narratives. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope and a fight for freedom.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that pre-colonial Africa was so much more than just what we're often told.
It was a continent with a rich and vibrant history filled with diverse and complex civilizations.
Empires, trade networks, centers of learning, interactions with the wider world, it was all happening long before Europe stepped in.
Exactly. And the narrative of a dark continent just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The evidence is overwhelming.
And throughout it, all the resilience and agency of the African people shine through.
From the Nubian kings in Egypt to those those who resisted slavery and fought for their freedom. It's a history of strength and determination in the face of adversity.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How different would our understanding of the world be if we truly acknowledged and celebrated these histories?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. And what other stories are waiting to be discovered? What other hidden chapters of African history are out there? It's an invitation to keep exploring and learning. Because this history matters. It's a part of all of us.